Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome in to the Bet the Board podcast, college football week 2. And oh, did we have a great opening week schedule for some very fine members of this podcast and listeners alike. Plenty of national storylines to get to, and of course, marquee matchups as a lot of these teams will finally get their first litmus test of the season. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by college football analyst extraordinaire Brad Powers and my co-host, not just for this, but also the National Football League, Payne Insider. Gentlemen, how goes it this fine Wednesday morning?
Doing well. Probably not as well as Payne, though. I'll let him take it.
You know what, Brad? I had a chance to speak to him on Sunday. I wanted to gauge the temperature of the room. He was remarkably calm, and whether that's because he was partaking in illicit substances or he's maturing at this old age right now, but he had that quiet confidence about him. I'm not sure that same thing could have been said at halftime if we had a live feed of what was going on with all those undisciplined penalties, but he seemed to be in a very good place when Florida State put the hurting on the Tigers.
He was remarkably calm, at least what I could gauge through text during the game. There was still quiet confidence even during the game.
So we may as well start there, guys, and obviously we'll get to Colorado. Brad, want to get your take on the now college football phenomenon that's not just in the betting market but everywhere with Deion Sanders and company. But Payne, you know, Florida State's a team that you had a great read on coming into the campaign. We obviously don't oftentimes gravitate towards some of the marquee games for our best bets. Gave them out +3. That game closed as low as 1 at some of the sharper shops, and Florida State's offense did not disappoint as their talented wide receivers got going. Jordan Travis settled into a rhythm, and we saw the defense completely take away what LSU wanted to do on the ground.
You're not going to let me talk about Colorado?
No, we will.
Who cares about Florida
We will.
State? Who cares
We
about
will.
Florida
We're going to
State?
let you get there. You can take your shots at LSU, at Clemson, and everybody else. We'll get some of the things that we saw off of our chest before we get into this week's games.
Everything, and here's like the overarching viewpoint of this, and this is why I bust your balls a little bit, because you always have this or present this idea that I'm some Florida State homer, and it's the exact opposite. The one thing we always tell people starting in this business is become a specialist first. Figure out if you're good enough at that before you expand. And whether that's a region of the country, whether that's a conference, whether it's a couple teams in a state, specialize. And when you do that and you know everything about these teams, that's me in the state of Florida. And so just the little things that we talked about being multiple, and we saw that in the second half. I mean, rolling out 3 tight end sets and just playing bully ball. One of the things we said in the best bet section, which is going completely in the weeds, is I wasn't sure Robert Scott was going to be fit enough to play left tackle. Basically missed most of fall camp. He was in for 3 series. Then Bless Harris took over, was the best pass protecting lineman on the entire team. You go back to the season preview. One of the guys that did not start in this game that I thought had the best pedigree was Keandre Jones, because as a freshman, played at Auburn, was fantastic as a mauler against SEC competition. There isn't a single guy on Florida State's offensive line that had a pedigree of that kind of play against that type of competition. And sure enough, he was inserted in the second half, and suddenly Florida State could run the football. So becoming a specialist will allow you to do certain things like that, and you find an edge. And so in a game like that where you have Brad, who knows Brian Kelly inside and out, and me, who knows Florida State inside and out, that becomes the result. It's not being a homer. It's just having really, really good information.
I mean, the reality of it is we wouldn't call you a homer if you weren't objective in the way you approach all of this. We know that money is first and foremost in any of this. It's a sports betting podcast after all, so there's no objective bias that gets in the mix. So I apologize to some of the listeners who think I lay it on pretty thick when it comes to some of the Florida schools, but there's nobody more equipped to try and handle that than Payne. And I also have to give both of you guys full marks for mentioning Harold Perkins, who LSU fans were irate about us calling him out. Brad, you talked about how he was going to be limited in terms of his effectiveness given the positional change. And when it gets called out on the broadcast that Harold Perkins hadn't really been called at all, it's a credit to everything that you guys do going inside the X's and O's, finding an edge, and Florida State really neutralized him as a defensive factor.
Yeah, it's something, a big storyline coming out of the game, but I didn't hear hardly anybody, at least nobody in our neck of the woods, bring it up before the game as far as questioning us and the position move of Harold Perkins. And, Payne mentioned it being a Brian Kelly specialist. I've already seen this story before. I saw it in 2015, Jalen Smith out of position for Notre Dame, just an entire season. A guy that should have been, it still was the vocal point because he was so talented on the defensive side of the ball, but could have been a first-team All-American had he been in the right position. So I've seen that story before. With Brian
all is
Kelly.
not lost, of course, for LSU fans that are out there. Obviously, you'll have plenty of opportunities to get big wins in the SEC, and it's also the reason the betting market hasn't quite overreacted to the price on LSU to win the SEC West. But they will need to solidify some things defensively. Not this week against Grambling before SEC play kicks off. But gentlemen, from the current iteration of Florida State under Mike Norvell to one of its most recognizable faces, a player who made his impact on the field in Tallahassee, now doing it in Boulder. When we look at Colorado, I don't think any of us anticipated them going into Fort Worth and knocking off TCU outright as nearly a 3-touchdown underdog. Now, the one thing that I will say is we may look back on this game that Colorado isn't as good as that initial performance, but TCU clearly has some issues they have to figure out. We've seen it over the last 4 games defensively, what this team has allowed in terms of chunk yardage against Georgia, against Michigan, against Colorado, and even in the Big 12 championship against Kansas State. But when we look at Colorado, Brad, overall, I mean, this was a team that you mentioned you had upgraded a ton. You weren't sure if their number was going to be accurate based on how they overhauled the roster with 87 fresh faces. What's your biggest takeaway and how you go about making adjustments, making sure that you're not overreacting, but at the same time not underreacting?
Yeah, so obviously I get a lot of hate on Twitter for being, a Colorado hater. I can see that. Certainly, I just thought they were, there was too much exuberance in the marketplace for a season win total and some of the future prices. But, I mean, the reality still was coming into this season, I upgraded Colorado more than any team in the country. And that's saying something considering that they were bottom 2 or 3 as far as returning experience and production. You gave Deion the benefit of the doubt that he clearly upgraded the roster as far as talent. But generally speaking, I try to take a more conservative approach when we see things when it comes to power ratings, because it's always regression towards me. Now, nobody's as good as what they seem to be, or nobody's as bad. But with that being said, not only did I upgrade Colorado more than any team in the country coming in the season, after week 1, I upgraded Colorado more than any team in the country. And typically, even though I'm a lot more aggressive as far as power rating changes, obviously week 1, 2, 3, I'm changing teams, 1 point, 2 point, 3 points typically. I went ahead and upgraded Colorado 6 points. I've never done that before, to be honest with you. 6 points after one game against a team that I'm kind of questioning in TCU. But it looks like the market upgraded them 10 points. So, I mean, because openers come out, I'm betting Nebraska. And you can get into that, what the game of the year line was just a week ago. Literally, you can bet this game, a week ago at multiple sports books. And we're seeing a 10-plus, a 10-point line move. So, and that was not with, it wasn't two sides of the coin. Nebraska bad, Colorado great. Nebraska was good. Nebraska overachieved. So you had to upgrade Nebraska's power rating. So I'm not there yet, so you can call me a Colorado hater. I still have my doubts.
It's just wild to see. We obviously saw one prominent book open Colorado as much as a 5-point favorite. That was cleaned out of the market. My gut tells me you had something to do with that, as the number is settled down to the key at 3. But you see all the storylines already circulating for a game that'll go off at noon Eastern, 9 o'clock out here on the West Coast. Friend of the show, Dave Mason, tweeted out from his shop that this could be the most heavily bet college football game that they have in their company's history. You look at the one-way one-way traffic coming in on the game, and I think it's a fascinating narrative for all the reasons that you outlined, Brad. When you look at the Buffaloes, if they go out there and exceed odds makers' expectations here, the adjustments that'll come knowing they're going to have their hands filled with upcoming tests, maybe not against Colorado State in the Rocky Mountain Showdown, but subsequent weeks against Oregon and USC. But gentlemen, with the sweet comes the sour. And Payne, when we watched ACC football on Monday night, clearly Florida State's biggest threat, at least on paper, coming into the year was Clemson. I'm not sure what to call that performance against Duke because it wasn't as bad as the 7 points illustrate. But when you don't punt and you don't score in the second half, it's clearly an anomaly in a college football game.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it right there. Listen to Dabo's post-game presser, and he was a little stunned, and you have a team that throws for over 200, runs for over 200, didn't really hit any explosives, and that was something we discussed a little bit based upon the talent at wide receiver and the way that Duke plays, right? I mean, they go out there and try to limit explosives. They play this umbrella coverage and make you dink and dunk the ball down the field. It's exactly what we said in the preview. We thought the defensive line could hold up just enough to pose that threat where you're giving up 4 or 5 yards a carry, but the clock is running. And we anticipated when we discussed that game, right? 56 was the total at the time, that it would dip below the key number 55. It sure as shit did. And so I think we had a pretty good read on that game. But to your point, some poor variance. Clemson did not punt in the second half, and somehow that led to 0 points. It makes me a little nervous now. And going back to Florida State, right? You'd hope that power rating number is a little bit better. You don't want to see that loss because you want Florida State's strength of schedule to be at peak. And suddenly, probably gives a little bit of a different viewpoint for that game come week 4 if somehow now Clemson is a road dog.
I'll tell you one thing about that.
Or a home dog.
Yeah, home dog. I'll tell
yeah.
you one thing about that game, Payne. We have a prominent Florida State alumnus in my family who will be out here for that game. I told him he can watch by himself because he may drop plenty of expletives if Clemson were to get off to a quick start in that spot. But no doubt, obviously, puts a massive microscope on that contest for Clemson to kind of salvage things against Florida State, given what we saw on Monday night. But all right, guys, just wanted to kind of do a quick little recap of what we saw week 1. I know it's always one of those data points that most of the college football world has to react to in a strong fashion because it's essentially the first time that we see these teams play notable competition. And one of these teams that we're about to talk about will be under the bright lights on Friday. We saw them need some late heroics to escape as more than a touchdown favorite in their home opener against Toledo. That, of course, would be the Illinois Fighting Illini, who find themselves 3-point road underdogs on the road in Lawrence, Kansas. Total on the game 57, and this will mark the first meeting between these programs since 1968. When you look at the illustrious football histories of both of these programs, there wasn't much to write home about over the last handful of years, but they were arguably two of the biggest surprise stories in 2022. Illinois started out the season 7-1, got as high as 14 in the AP poll, their highest ranking since 2007, would subsequently lose their next 3 games before finishing 8-5. Meanwhile, Kansas started out 5-0. They got as high as 19 in the AP poll, first time they were ranked at all since 2009, lost the next 3 games, finished 6-7, but the most wins and their first bowl appearance since 2008. There is a level of familiarity between the head coaches. A good story on KUSports.com out this week about how Lance Leipold leaned on Brett Bielema when he was winning national championships at UW-Whitewater, didn't have the facilities, and even went down to Fayetteville to pick Bielema's brain when he took the job at Buffalo about how important logistics and schedule were when you were building a program. Clearly, Kansas fans reaping the benefits of that right now. But Payne, I'll come to you first. When we look at Kansas, we know this is typically a run-first offense. This is a group that wants to lean on Devin Neal and Daniel Hillshot in their backfield. Jalen Daniels didn't get the start in their season opener against Southeast Missouri State. It was instead veteran backup Jason Bean. All signs point to Daniels being a full go here despite dealing with a balky back. And I guess the biggest question that I have for you, will Kansas have enough in the passing game to really test an Illinois secondary that's a little bit green behind the ears, knowing that some of their key contributors had moved on to the next level?
Yeah, I think that's the next step. Yes, Kansas might want to run the ball. They're not very efficient doing it. Some explosiveness out of that, especially when you have a guy like Jalen Daniels, but very much what the next step for that Kansas offense was last year was being able to push the ball downfield. You mentioned the slow start against Missouri State. It's nice having a guy like Jason Bean stick around, but not better than Jalen Daniels. Now, everything being said publicly is Jalen Daniels was healthy enough to play, but they wanted to give him another week. We'll see. I think ultimately you hit that perfectly. Is like the key to this game is an offense that's returning virtually every single key cog in the vast majority of production against an Illinois defense that we projected to take a step back after losing some high-end talent, specifically in the secondary. And I think this will be the first test where we see if Jalen Daniels' accuracy is actually improved. And we talked about some of the growth there last year in this new look offense, which was increasing his aggressiveness. And we saw that. Jalen Daniels was willing to push the ball down the field. His ADOT ticked up over a full yard last year, but the problem was the accuracy didn't come with it. The accuracy dipped about 7%. And I just think we need to see a little bit more from him in that department. And you could see that here. I mean, the Illinois secondary clearly took a step back, especially when you lose high-end talent to the NFL. Illinois is also replacing 4 starters in that secondary. It's just not one dude in Witherspoon. 3 of those guys were taken in the top 66 picks of April's draft, and Illinois is recruiting a little bit better, but they're not recruiting to the point where you're replacing 3 NFL guys in the top 66 picks in one offseason. If you look on paper, Illinois held Toledo to a 39% passing success rate game 1. But you look at Daquan Finn and you look at Toledo's offense, they're not going to try to wing it all over the park and test you aggressively. I mean, Toledo's offense I think, relying on one of the better MAC O-lines. You got a couple nice backs, and you use Daquan Finn's legs to create that extra man advantage in the box. They were not tested in that week 1 game through the air, and I think it's the polar opposite for Kansas. When you look at this offense and what Andy Koltonecki forces you to do, basically keeps your eyes sound in coverage. Kansas was actually top 25 in explosiveness with Jalen Daniels when he was under center last year. I haven't bet this game. Very much feels like an information game to me, right? If Jalen Daniels is 100%, you probably feel okay. And the word was he was projected to play last week and didn't. And then you get reports out of Labor Day's practice, and Lance Leipold says, Jalen Daniels is 100% expected to be out there. You also think about the short week here for Illinois. Probably not as large of a factor. Brad, what do you think? In week 2, probably not as large as a factor as it would be like, say, week 9, where there's more fatigue and depth being tested because of injuries. But, you get the extra day of rest. Then you don't lose the day of travel either. So, from that perspective, Kansas does have a little bit of an edge there. But ultimately, I think we're going to find out a lot about these teams. If Jalen Daniels is taking that next step as a passer, how long is it going to take Illinois secondary to kind of figure some things out this season? Probably not going to be as good early on as they progress later on in the season with all those new parts.
You mentioned Illinois secondary too, and they were dealing with a couple injuries on the back end. Tyson Rook's unavailable for the game, and they actually lost Tyler Strain due to a concussion. Going to want to monitor his status because you do want all hands on deck. And Aaron Henry had talked about these guys being assignment sound and how much more important it was going to be going into hostile territory to take on a Kansas team that loves some of the eye candy up front. To your point, likes to run the football to set things up. They'll need a much better push from their defensive line if they're going to be successful. Real quick, Brad, on the other side of the ball, we know that Kansas's Achilles heel last year was their defense. Quite frankly, they didn't play any when they stepped up in class. We started to get flashes of what Luke Altmaier could mean to this Illinois offense in the second half. They did need that pick 6 to kind of spur them on, but I have to give Toledo a little bit of credit. They took away what we thought was going to be Illinois' primary receiving weapon in Isaiah Williams early. They didn't allow him to catch those bubble screens and turn short completions into big gains. So they went to Pat Bryant, but the ground game needs someone to truly emerge to take the place of Chase Brown that we know was the bell cow for this group a season ago.
Yeah, and I didn't see enough last week as far as the running back position. I would say most effective runner was actually Altmaier, surprisingly. Showed a lot of mobility with 69 rushing yards. He looked solid with it being his first start in a new place, and had to be to win that game. I guess my most disappointing thing out of Illinois, not only offensive line but defensive line, at the line of scrimmage where I expected them to have success, to have their way against Toledo, just was not there in the run game offensively, was not there in the run game defensively. They will get tested a lot more to further expand on Payne's point about, the rest factor. I agree that it's, not as big here. It's only week 2. You haven't been grinding down for 8-9 weeks at this point. But I do think it is a factor, though, and I'll put it to you guys this way: take it, as you're trying to catch your legs here at the start of the season. NFL starting, college football. You're going through a bunch of games. Take away a day. Take away a day of your prep as you're leading into the games for the week, and see how prepared you feel, or a lack thereof. And I also think I look at play counts. Kansas defense 48 plays last week. Illinois 79, and one less day, and traveling. So I think if you're not at least giving Kansas another half point, maybe even a full point on the game power rating, I think you're doing yourself a disservice.
Interesting matchup for two teams that obviously want to continue to get off on the right foot, and this would go a long way as far as a non-conference win against a Power 5 opponent to build a little bit of mojo. Kansas, of course, a glorified dress rehearsal in their opener, getting their starting quarterback back, and Illinois needing late heroics to get through the Toledo Rockets. From Friday night into Saturday, in a game that'll kick off early at Carter Finley Stadium in Raleigh, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish will take their show on the road to take on NC State. Notre Dame more than a touchdown road favorite in the contest, total of 51.5. And why is all of that important? It's the battle of two of the most decorated ACC quarterbacks at their respective programs. The problem is Sam Hartman did all of his damage as a member of Wake Forest, and when you look at Brennan, did most of his damage as a member of the Virginia football program. Notre Dame faces one of just 8 FBS teams it has a losing record against in multiple meetings. Comes with the caveat that it is a very small sample size of 3. You look at the Irish, they did what you need to do against some of the bottom feeders, taking care of Navy and Tennessee State by a combined 92 points. I joked with you, Brad, on Twitter, saying it's the best margin through 2 games since 1932, and they beat Drake and Haskell combined for a 135-point margin of victory there. When you look at NC State, we know Carter Finley can be a very difficult place to play. The dynamic's slightly different when you look at it during the daytime than if this was under the bright lights. The first question, Brad, I guess goes to you. When it comes to Notre Dame and what you've seen out of them for the first 2 games, Sam Hartman has been ultra efficient. He's gone out there and done everything that's been asked of him, but it hasn't exactly come against a murderer's row. How much can we truly learn about what this Notre Dame offense will look like and how their execution will be when they step up in class for the first true test of the season?
Yeah, when Payne asks for a key factor, to me, that is the key factor, at least on this side of the ball. What happens when Notre Dame faces some adversity? Because the reality is they haven't faced any. They haven't trailed at a single minute at any point in any of the games so far this season. Sam Hartman hasn't been sacked, hasn't seen consistent pressure. But I guess my biggest takeaway from Notre Dame's first 2 games is operationally, for a new quarterback, a transfer quarterback, still a very young receiving core, new offensive coordinator, new quarterback coach, still a young head coach, and 2 new starters on the interior of the offensive line. It's been clean. They've exceeded expectations. Hell, they covered a 49-point spread last week, something I didn't think they were capable of, coming off a long plane trip to Ireland and back. Not a lot of delay of game penalties, not a lot of stupid mental errors. But that's saying something when you look across the rest of college football and you see it consistently, especially in week 1. So it's Sam Hartman, for all the expectations, I got to tell you guys, has exceeded them as far as I'm concerned. And Notre Dame has an NFL quarterback right now playing for them. And I don't mean Patrick Mahomes or an Aaron Rodgers type. I mean a guy that if he chooses to do so and wants to be a 10-year backup in the league, he can do so. And if you don't believe me, go watch the 2-minute drill of both of the games at the end of the first half. It is stuff that you would see on Sunday. Every throw consistent, the clock management, unbelievable. So I'm not. I know you joked with me before we came on, but typically if this was Brian Kelly as a head coach and with his quarterbacks, I would be extremely concerned. I would have an NC State ticket in my pocket right now saying upset alert. I'm not that concerned when Sam Hartman's behind center.
I want to come right back to you on that Sam Hartman point, Brad. When you look at what he's been able to do, completed more than 80% of his passes in each of the first 2 games. It's something that he only accomplished once during his entire time at Wake Forest. Now, I know the building blocks around him are substantially better. You mentioned some of that inexperience, and I think that's one of the big questions when you look at the Irish offensive line, how guys like Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler will hold up in their first true road game. And then you layer in the level of familiarity that Tony Gibson has facing Sam Hartman, as he's gone up against the NC State defense each of the last 3 years. And you look at the numbers, from a completion percentage standpoint, 2 games above 60%. The yardage has been there, but over the last 2 meetings, 6 interceptions. In this kind of spot, do you feel you kind of throw all that out, or does that level of familiarity help or hurt one particular side of the ball, whether it be the Notre Dame offense, Sam Hartman knowing this team, or NC State having matched up against him relatively effectively in 2 of the last 3 meetings?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's just a different level of athlete that's surrounding Sam Hartman than the one he had at Wake Forest. So I would say it's probably more advantageous for Sam Hartman knowing the NC State Tony Gibson defense. And look, I think there was some concerns on how Sam would adjust to a pro-style set after being, in a mesh style for 5 years. But I thought Payne hit it out of the park talking about, when he gets a clean pocket, how effective he was. He's been, a lot of the reasons for the interceptions is Sam Hartman's not 6'4", 6'5". I mean, he was dealing with what the term is muddy pockets. And, in some games, he because he's not 6'4", 6'5", and he has to get rid of the football because he's facing pressure and he's get pressure in his face. He has that meltdown every season with 3, 4, 5 interceptions in a single game. I'm going to jinx it for this game, but I don't think you get that this year because he's going to have such more of a clean pocket when you got two of the better tackles in the country.
Payne, coming into the year, Tony Gibson offered up some strong comments on his defense, and I'll quote him directly in all of this. In all of my years of coaching in this defense, I think this is the best defensive line I've ever had. It's a full unit deeper than we've ever been. We feel good about 8 guys going in the game at any time. I like where we're at. We've got a lot of depth. Again, it's more depth than we've ever had. Guys that we can put in a game and not have to worry or change positions. I'm not sure I saw that in game 1 against UConn. Now, granted, these comments came before the season started, but you look at how they struggle with some of their gap assignments. I know there is some noise in the numbers. There was one big run for UConn. If you back that out, they held the Huskies to about 3.1 yards per carry overall. But we talk a lot about Sam Hartman, but this is a Notre Dame team that can run the football. They have a deep stable of backs. Audric Estime has gotten the lion's share thus far. When you look at NC State defensively, you pointed out in our ACC preview, you had some real questions about this unit taking a major step back, given what we've seen from Dave Dorn and company over the last couple of years.
I think you guys have hit it perfectly on all of the main talking points to this game. And it's not just what Notre Dame's ground game can do. It's what Sam Hartman does to open up that ground game as well. That's why having a guy like Hartman in this offense is so huge. And I think, this is the first test. And I know Brad's a little bit nervous heading on the road. NC State, they really haven't played anybody with Navy and Tennessee State. Obviously, not difficult opponents, but the one thing that we're able to do now, right, in the year 2023 is with all these fancy metrics, right, if a unit's exceeded expectation or underperformed, right? If you're playing Georgia's defense, that expectation is lower. If you're playing tomato cans, as Brad says, right, the expectation is higher. And so to me, Notre Dame's offense has exceeded expectation in the first 2 games. It's just very clear there's an adult in the room. Notre Dame's gone out and gained 97% of available yards on drives with Sam Hartman under center. I think when we're talking about Tony Gibson, though, and the one thing I will comment on, I completely agree with Brad in terms of the familiarity assessment. When you face Sam Hartman 3 times, it's a completely different offense. So Tony Gibson's preparing for a completely different offense. Sam Hartman's preparing for the same defense he's already seen 3 times. We talked about the 3-3-5, I think, this offseason, and the experience in playing that defense, that style is very key. And so when you're outside the top 100 in returning defensive production, that's going to be a big hit for NC State. When you run this sophisticated style, I think experience truly matters more than other types of defenses, because NC State goes out and plays with a light box. And you look last year, they played with the light box, but they finished top 5 in rushing success rate. And it's because Tony Gibson likes to stunt. He likes to run blitz. So there's pressure on linebackers and safeties to play downhill and fill and fit the right hole and know their exact responsibility. I didn't see that against UConn. I mean, I know you mentioned the difference in numbers if you back out the long run, but over 50% of UConn's runs grade successful. And then you do have that explosive by Victor Rosa down the sideline looking like Forrest Gump out there on the 71.
I mean, honestly,
right?
watching that run back, it looked like I could have clocked him with a sundial.
You keep that rush in there because the explosive is kind of part of my thought process here, right? When you got those young guys, the less experience filling those holes, like it's going to lead to explosives like that. And now you get this Notre Dame offensive line with experience and talent. I would say, and Brad can correct me if I'm wrong, arguably the best unit on the team, especially how they trended last year. I mean, this was an offensive line that ended up top 15 in offensive line yards created. Only 11% of run plays were stuffed. That was top 5 in the country. And then you have a back like Audric Estime, who might not be the most explosive, but when he sees a hole, he's getting downhill. He's hitting it. He's like a bowling ball. It's tough to bring down. First 2 weeks, Estime's averaging nearly 5.5 yards after first contact. So from everything that we have seen and heard in spring and fall, what our projections called for. The singular data point against UConn. The matchup. To me, it's kind of the least shocking thing that the books that opened below a touchdown got hit. I know it's NC State's home opener. Carter Finley can be a house of horrors, and it has been to better teams than this version of Notre Dame. But I think somewhere between 7.5 and 9 is probably the correct pregame pricing.
You mentioned, Payne, where this side opened. Have we seen anything on the total? I know it opened in the high 40s at some shops. Either you guys feel free to weigh in terms of the question marks we have about NC State's defense. And, of course, Sam Hartman. You talked about him picking up 97.5% of the available yards. By my count, it's 9 touchdowns in 9 drives that he's led in the first half against Tennessee State and Navy.
Yeah, Brad, I'll kind of let you expound, but my initial thought process was, just very generic. NC State defense down a touch, Notre Dame offense substantially up. Notre Dame defensive line probably still has not been tested to this point.
Yeah.
Maybe here, right? Even though we don't love the weapons of NC State, certainly I think you would say Armstrong is an upgraded quarterback. Anai, I was a little surprised to see them not go as fast as I initially thought. So that first number you mentioned, Todd, probably a good bet over. Once it got to 52.5, 53, like we saw some buyback under. And then once we got back to 50, very quietly, a sharp group went off the screen. It did trickle onto it, but that's now why we're back up to like 51.5.
Fair.
It's tough for me. Yeah, I'm going to say this. It's tough for me to get around to betting an over at the current number when you pop in the tape and you don't see hardly any explosives from that NC State offense last week. I mean, did not have a single play longer than 20 yards. I question the weapons around Armstrong. Now, with that being said, I mean, we got Armstrong running around back there. Anything can happen. Maybe get some broken down, the plays by Notre Dame's defense that hasn't been tested. But my goodness, that offense for NC State, that was an ugly performance.
Still plenty of ground to cover, guys, to get through all of the Saturday slate. But I want to remind all of our loyal Bet the Board listeners, if they're tuning in for the first time, listening to our college breakdowns, they'll get NFL Week 1 access on all podcast platforms where you like to download for Bet the Board NFL coverage. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there at Payne. Oh, I guess you're going by at Payne, not at Payne Insider. I can't keep track at this point. You can follow me at Todd Fuhrman, and most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, encourage everyone out there. It's free. It's easy. Subscribe to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter. All sorts of great nuggets, information, things that you may have missed during the week, in addition to typically an additional best bet right to you on Friday. A great way to get you through the end of the work week. From the East Coast to the West Coast we go, gentlemen, from Raleigh to the Palouse, where Washington State will welcome in Wisconsin in the second of a home-and-home series. It's Wisconsin, though, nearly a touchdown favorite. We'll call them 6.5 point road favorites. Total 58.5. It is up a touch from where this number opened. And, Brad, I'll start with you even before we get into the game itself. It's now the second straight week we've seen substantial movement against the Washington State Cougars. We saw them get all the way bet down to around an 8.5, 9-point favorite against Colorado State. We saw Wisconsin take money in the Luke Fickell, Phil Longo debut last week. Market indicators obviously didn't lead bettors astray who wanted to get ahead of it. We see money against Washington State and money in on Wisconsin getting this price to settle where it currently has.
Yeah, so, I mean, everybody wants picks. Everybody wants fish. They just want it handed to them. here's a teach a man to fish moment. And you don't have to be that smart to figure some of this out. I think you broke it down eloquently already. Week 1 markets, one of the biggest line movers, if you followed all summer, was a fade on Washington State. That line moved, even conservatively, about a touchdown against Washington State. On the other side, one of the biggest pro positions on a single team was Wisconsin. That line moved a touchdown, with Wisconsin going from 22.5 up to, blowing right through 28. 28.5 is where that closed. So even though anybody that bet any of those numbers on those significant moves did not cash those tickets, you still had to assume that there would be money coming in on Wisconsin and fading Washington State this week. And when Circa opens 3, you don't have to be Elon Musk to figure this out, folks. That line's going to go up, and that's where it has. So everyone asks me, how do you know where lines are going to move? How are you sure on some of this stuff? Number one, having a good set of power ratings helps when the market moves towards your power ratings more often than not. But you don't even have to have a set of power ratings. Just follow where these moves are. And I would say, especially when you can stack up multiple weeks of data points where a team's getting heavily bet on or heavily bet against, if you want to get in front of some line moves, just pay attention to where line moves prior weeks.
If I'm the pupil here and you're obviously the professor, my first follow-up was going to be on this. What happens in a situation where one team, you see the Colorado State-Washington State game play out, bettors were down on Washington State. If Washington State were to exceed expectations, say, in this particular spot, do you kind of begin to reassess exactly what you saw, or do you stay true to, what you've studied, the numbers that you built, and go, you know what? 2 data points, not nearly a significant enough sample size that I believe in my process that I'm going to continue to look to get ahead of the market and or bet against this particular team?
It's a really good question, and I would. It obviously would be result dependent. Like how much disparity. Like did they lose by 3 and it was kind of fluky because a couple turnovers kept them in the game, or was it as disparate as last week where that was expected to be a competitive game? It wasn't. Say for using this week as an example, they're expected to lose. They win outright. There's nothing fluky about it. I would not be running the window next week to be fading Washington State. But as I say this in any matter, it all depends on the number. I mean, some of these books open up. FCS markets, I'm anticipating betting one team. Oh, this is going to be one of my favorite bets of the week. They'll open it 10 points off where I was expecting it to open, and I'm ending up betting the side that I was expecting to bet against.
Yeah, it changed the dynamic quite a bit, and I think that's a great point from you, Brad. For a lot of our listeners out there, no matter how long they've been doing this, whether it's the first season, trying to take college football a little bit more seriously, you can love a particular team, but it's all about the number at the end of the day. Betting a team -3 because you think they're going to win the game is a hell of a lot different than laying 7, depending on the price tags that the market will hang. And when you look at this matchup on paper, these teams played last year in Madison. It was Washington State going in there and winning outright 17-14 as right around a 17-point underdog. Cam Ward, 17-28, very workmanlike in that performance for 200 yards, was intercepted twice. The dynamic duo that was on full display in Luke Fickell's debut last week for Wisconsin performed admirably against the Cougs a season ago, with Chaz Malusi and Braylon Allen going for 142 rushing yards on 36 carries. When we begin to peel back the curtain a little bit, there are some ties from Jake Dykert, the head coach at Washington State. Grew up in the Milwaukee suburbs of Waukesha, so knows a lot about this Wisconsin program. Can't imagine he's going to have 200 friends and family members because last I checked, not exactly easy to get from Mitchell Airport out to Eastern Washington with that many people unless you're chartering a jet. But Payne, the biggest question people had about Wisconsin as they entered the 21st century was the offense. You bring in a new OC and Phil Longo. Luke Fickell took a ton of questions on his radio show about, we were told that it was going to be 80 to 85% passing, but anybody who's watched Longo run an offense, when they were at their best at North Carolina, it was 3 wide receivers, talented running backs that just had better lanes to run through. So when you try and assess Wisconsin, it sure looked different when you watch it with your eyes. Tanner Mordecai may have struggled a little bit, but clearly they weren't the pass-happy offense I think Badgers fans were hoping for at least week 1.
Tanner Mordecai struggled since he's been at Wisconsin. I mean, get any report, watch any spring game, even watch that game against Buffalo. We know the style of offense Phil Longo ultimately wants to run. And you can see it at times, right? Like Longo can't help himself but to call that Chuck and Duck series because it's in his blood. But it's very clear the Badgers don't have the pieces to play that way at ideal peak right now. It's going to take another offseason for a shift that large. I mean, it's a complete 180. And that's why Wisconsin only had 14 points in their home opener the first 37 minutes against the Buffalo defense that we had projected outside the top 100. And so I still think it becomes this battle of, Longo didn't show stubbornness in the second half. That was good, right? He was creating a variation of his offense and meshing it to the current personnel. But it's very clear, right? The best weapons Wisconsin has are still in the backfield with Braylon Allen and Ches Malusi, who average over 10 yards a carry as a tandem against Buffalo. You look on standard downs, your point is even more obvious, right? Like on standard downs, Wisconsin was successful on over 65% of runs against Buffalo, less than 35% success rate on passes. Now, you're going on the road. Hostile environment in Pullman. Not a familiar place to the Badgers either. And you look where Wazoo is most vulnerable on defense. It's up the middle. David Gusta had a fine opener against Colorado State, but there's not much past him on the interior of Washington State's defense. We said it in our preview podcast. Milani is heading into year 4, struggled in the opener, never been even a replacement level player. Naheem Rodman, a big 300-plus pounder, was added from Colorado in the portal, played poorly over 16 snaps against Colorado State, wasn't great prior to joining. Wazoo lost its top 3 linebackers. You had Hanley, who was the 85th pick to the Chargers. You saw Francisco Mayuga transfer to Miami. Travion Brown followed his defensive coordinator to Arizona State. The best linebacker Wazoo has in the middle is Devin Richardson, traditionally an outside linebacker, being asked to play in the middle. He hadn't played more than 100 snaps the past 3 seasons at New Mexico State and Texas, and here he is at Wazoo. So, to me, you got to be able to run right at Wazoo, right up the middle. If you look last week on standard downs, Colorado State was successful in 60% of runs against this Wazoo defense. So, kind of all just harkens back to Phil Longo being willing to rely on that Wisconsin ground game because it's what's most efficient for his offense, and on paper it's clearly like the best way to take that bully approach and take advantage of Wazoo right up the middle. I think with severe question marks at defensive tackle and linebacker.
Such an interesting matchup because you guys mentioned it, and we saw Tanner Mordecai at his best against SMU, look like the greatest thing since sliced bread from time to time. But he'd go on the road, he could be erratic, and I'll even take it one step further that they were much better receiving options that he had down there in Dallas than what he has currently on his team in Madison right now. Rashee Rice is obviously playing at the next level for a reason. We'll see if he works his...
Could we get him to catch a ball?
Well, that's what I was going to say. If he's open, he's like Featherstone out there from Necessary Roughness back in the day. Getting open is the key. We'll worry about catching somewhere on down the road. But
I think he had 5 drops in the preseason.
Get him out of your system now because they're going to need him to step up and be their number 1 if Travis Kelce's lost for an extended period of time. But definitely interesting because there is a path for Wisconsin, and typically when you look at these teams learning a new system going on the road, you'd much prefer them to be run-heavy instead of pass-dependent. We'll see if Chaz Malusi and Braylon Allen can replicate some of that success and what that Badgers defense will be able to do to slow down Cam Ward, who, as head coach Jake Dykert said, I do not want him to be our leading rusher in any game going forward like he was last week against Colorado State. Nakia Watson, of course, was the X factor, the Wisconsin transfer back last year, got into the end zone twice in what he described as one of his more emotional games. Should be a fun one to see how these two teams stack up. Wisconsin obviously thinks they have a chance to win the Big Ten West. Washington State wants to slide into that upper echelon of now what looks to be a suddenly deep Pac-12 conference. However, a bigger game on the board that's going to tell us quite a bit about two teams who need a win desperately will be unfolding in Miami Gardens, where Texas A&M comes down to take on the Miami Hurricanes, and we're looking at Texas A&M, a 4.5, or 5-point favorite, so do shop around depending on what side of the equation you fall on here. Total in this game opened 46.5 out to 51. More on that later, gentlemen. I'll let you boys discuss that particular component. Last year's meeting might have set football back 50 years for anybody that actually watched. Texas A&M escaped with a 17-9 win as both offenses were an absolute unmitigated disaster. It was Miami actually dominating on the stat sheet in the counting stats department Finished with a plus 11 first down advantage, outgained A&M by nearly 130 yards, just weren't able to turn those drives into scores, wasting countless red zone scoring opportunities. When you look at Jimbo Fisher, Florida has been a state that's extremely kind to him in the past. 60-9 as a head coach and games coach in the state of Florida, 15-0 in road and neutral games. Lost 6. However, when you look at A&M, this is a program that's now lost 6 straight road games, tied with Auburn for the longest streak in the conference. Meanwhile, Mario Cristobal needs a big win, 18-29 as head coach in games in the state of Florida, just 17-22 in home games. That, of course, goes back to some of his time at Florida International as well. Interesting matchups for these teams week one. Both went out there, faced inferior opponents from Group of 5 conferences. Both exceeded expectations and created maybe unfair expectations for two quarterbacks that I think a lot of people are looking for big seasons from. So, Payne, we can start with you when we look at the Texas A&M offense. This was a group we thought was going to be drastically improved if Jimbo Fisher was willing to cede controls to offensive coordinator Bobby Petrino. He was obviously welcomed with open arms. Connor Wegman, a career-high 5 passing touchdowns in week 1 versus the Lobos. This was a guy that was highly recruited. He was actually listed ahead of guys like Drew Allar and Cade Klubnik coming out by 247 Sports rankings. You saw some of those weapons on full display, Noah Thomas and Evan Stewart. But Miami believes they have a defensive backfield that can match up. I may not be so sure they're ready for what they're going to see here if A&M wants to take some of those vertical shots should they open themselves up in the passing game.
Remember this offseason, Jimbo, smartly didn't divulge what was going to transpire on offense, and a lot of people kind of ran with it that he wasn't going to fully hand the reins over to Bobby Petrino. But I think if you're looking, right off the bat, you're seeing a difference that was extremely different, right? Bobby Petrino is clearly having influence on A&M's offense, much faster pace, deeper shots downfield. A&M operated at a top 25 pace week 1. Jimbo ran one of the slowest offenses in all of college football last season. You mentioned Connor Wegman. His ADOT was nearly 5 yards higher than where it finished last season. Now, that's not going to maintain, but you could at least see the difference in passing intent and some of the route trees. To me, the biggest factor on this side of the ball is up front, though. And that's probably what's going to allow the other factor to truly matter, right? Can A&M's offensive line give Connor Wegman enough time to hit some of those intermediate and deep shots to the aforementioned Noah Thomas and Evan Stewart? I think everyone kind of believes the weak part of the Hurricanes defense are its corners. And to be expected, right? You lose Tyreek Stevenson, second-round pick. DJ Ivey was drafted by the Bengals as well. Even with those guys, and certainly there was some quit towards the back end of the season, but Miami finished outside the top 90 in explosive pass defense. You can see why Mario hit the portal and took 4 transfer cornerbacks. You talk to any beat writer or media member that covers the Canes on a daily basis, corner is the question. What's interesting, though, is to be able to attack that area of the Hurricanes defense, you got to be able to protect up front. And so I'm a little interested to see how this looks. The A&M offensive line struggled in pass protection against New Mexico. And Miami also didn't generate much pressure against Miami of Ohio. So we don't have a good data point for either against the inferior competition that you mentioned. Now both are stepping up in class and you're trying to project. So there's some variance there up front. But what's very interesting and somewhat concerning is Connor Wegman got rid of the ball against New Mexico at a lightning fast rate, 2.3 seconds on average. He was pressured on over 46% of dropbacks, and so that's as bad as it gets. So it's one of those underlying metrics you file away because most just see the 52 points and think A&M solved every single offensive issue that they've ever had. That was concerning to me. Now you flip it around to the other side. Miami only generated a 26% pressure rate on Miami, Ohio. Part of that was Miami, Ohio getting rid of the ball quickly. And I do think Nigel Kelly and Ruben Bain are foregone conclusions that they'll be very, very good edge rushers, but they're still a little raw, still young. If Miami can't get home naturally, then Lance Gidger's going to have to send some extra bodies and leave the secondary guys that we have questions about on island. So for A&M to be able to attack that area of weakness, they have to be able to protect up front. And so to me, that's the biggest matchup there. And again, I've not read, I've not seen, I've not heard anybody talk about that area of A&M's offense, which being that offensive line. Everyone's just kind of focusing on the pace. Everyone's focusing on, the deep shots. Everyone sees 52 points on the scoreboard. Very concerning when New Mexico is generating a 46% pressure rate and Wegman's getting the ball off in 2.3 seconds.
There was one article out there, and I apologize should that particular individual be listening to this podcast that I'm not properly crediting, that talked a little bit about the Aggies having protection issues, specifically at right tackle, left guard, center, and running back, that the Aggies tried to keep their backs and tight ends a little bit more than A&M insiders anticipated, utilizing 7-man protections. So all of the things that you highlighted there, clearly not lost at A&M, and I'm not sure they're able to fix those, week over week against the Miami team that does have some of the bodies you alluded to that could get in the backfield. We just didn't see what they look like against Miami of Ohio. So going to be an interesting chess match there. On the other side of the ball, Brad, Shannon Dawson, the new offensive coordinator from Miami, basically said A&M's a talented team. You can look at their bodies, and they're bigger, they're longer, and they're faster. So the sense of urgency at every position needs to improve and has to improve. That naturally happens through the course of preparation. Kids know they watch them. The big takeaway for Miami is they were able to run the football effectively against Miami of Ohio. It was the most rushing yards they had in a game since 2020, where they racked up 337 against UAB. 4 players carried the ball 8 times. But when you look at this Miami offense, I think people are high on Tyler Van Dyke. We've seen him at his best, but we've seen him struggle when he got benched last year. But as far as A&M, this was a group that couldn't stop the run last year. A little bit head-scratching given all of the 4- and 5-star recruits there. They think that side is improved, but there are question marks about the back end. Miami, when you're building an offensive game plan, Brad, do you think they have the receivers to really put stress on the Aggies' corners, or how do you think they go about trying to attack A&M where they're potentially at their weakest?
So I'm optimistic. I know it's just one data point, but I'm optimistic about the abilities of Miami's offense to have some success in this game. And honestly, they've had some, between the 20s last year, they had success in last year's game. They just couldn't figure it out in the red zone. I mean, they had nearly 400 yards, and that was a banged up Miami wide receiver unit last year in that game against A&M. That's what started at that game there with Restrepo injured and missing, half the season. Speaking of Restrepo, he's back, he's healthy. And I got to tell you, and I was texting with Payne about this yesterday, Tyler Van Dyke looks like an entirely different quarterback because Restrepo's in the lineup. It's his safety valve.
I was going to say, Brad, that's just because he doesn't have to work with Josh Gaddis anymore, but I digress.
Well, yeah, true. I was going to get to there, but it certainly looked like the quarterback we saw 2 years ago. And yeah, I mean, another point to your point, Todd, 400 yards nearly on the road early in the season with Josh Gaddis as your offense coordinator. And now you don't have him, and you got a healthy wide receiver unit. So yeah, I am optimistic, and it's, the run game, you mentioned the balance, very deep, 4 guys, combined for 35 carries for 251 rushing yards. You look, that created some advantageous spots for Van Dyke to take advantage on play action when you got a healthy run game. He was 8 out of 8 on play action. The wide receiver core, not just Restrepo in the slot, but Colby Young showed some explosiveness on an early touchdown. Jacoby George is there. There's some weapons here for Miami. I would say this. I know people are going to say they were just playing Miami of Ohio. I do watch MAC football. Miami, Ohio is one of the better defenses in the MAC, and they had 9 starters back. So I thought that was a really solid performance to have 243 pass, 250 rush. That doesn't get much better than that. And, it does start up front for them. Rewatching the game, I thought the left side on the offensive line was really good in the first half. Rivers on that left tackle, they kind of switched it up post-spring. Cohen, the transfer, is there at left guard. And I think, the major reason why this Miami offensive line looked better is that the transfer from UCF, an emotional leader both on and off the field, Matt Lee, has gotten rave reviews all off season long, and again looked the part. Now let's go to the other side, Texas A&M's defense. You mentioned it. Last year I would say it's the old saying, look like Tarzan, played like Jane. I mean, that's what the Texas A&M defensive line looked like last year. I mean, allowing more than 200 rushing yards per game. With that kind of talent, I don't care if they're true freshmen. I don't care if they're sophomores. That's unacceptable. Now, last week, all those guys obviously back, not only up front, but the majority of the A&M's defense is back. Counting stats look okay. 222 yards to New Mexico. Sounds great, but New Mexico actually had less yards in last year's game, in half their games, they had less than 222 yards. So I actually expected more out of Texas A&M's defense last week. Shamar Stewart looked the part at defensive end, like a lot of their athletes. Josh DeBerry, a transfer from BC, was one of their better players on the defensive side of the ball. Edgerrin Cooper had a good game, but what kind of concerns me is a couple of their leaders expected to be their best players, Fadil Diggs, Damani Richardson. I mean, if you look at what Pro Football Focus graded them at, they had 30 different graded A&M defenders in the game. A lot of guys got snaps. Diggs was number 25 on that A&M defense. Richardson number 22. That's not what you want to see about from your veteran guys who are expected to be your best players. So I needed to see more from that A&M defense. And here's something, outside the box a little bit. Obviously, they had a new defensive coordinator last year. They lose Mike Elko, who was an elite defensive coordinator. You look and see what Mike Elko's done in a year and a half at Duke. That was a significant loss. And the big downgrade of defensive coordinator from A&M here in the last year plus. And I just didn't see it, even though the counting stats look good, allowing just 10 points.
Yeah, it's always interesting because you look at A&M on paper and the expectations are that this defense is supposed to be real good. But year-over-year improvement that we thought we could see right out of the gates, we didn't quite see against the Lobos. This, of course, will be a better measuring stick to figure out if they've solidified some of those concerns or they're going to continue to persist. One thing, Brad, not to go off on a tangent, I want to close up Payne with you on the numbers on this game. Is Chuck Martin ever going to enter the 21st century and decide to go for it on 4th and short, or is he going to continue to punt from plus territory as long as he's the head coach at Miami of Ohio?
Probably not. I hope he does. There's a hint. I hope he does a little more aggressive this week because I got some money riding on them this
I can
week.
respect that. The side paint on this game hasn't really moved much. We saw one shop open at 3, but we saw another prominent shop open at 5, and it's kind of settled in the middle. You have seen a little bit of over money come in. Listening to both of you guys talk about some of the advantages that you believe the offenses can have against their defensive counterparts, I would lead me to believe that you guys are kind of that same mindset. Wasn't sure if the ship had sailed too far from 46.5 though out to 51.
Brad, I'll let you go.
Oh, yeah, word leaked. I was told to keep it quiet. I was told to keep it quiet, and I was keeping it quiet, but I got asked on a certain podcast about the game, and we went.
You crumbled. You crumbled under pressure, I heard. Through a source.
Next time it'll be no comment. But okay. I did mention it. If you were a watcher of the show, I said I'm going to get in big time trouble for this, and we fired too early.
Payne, you know what they say around these parts: loose lips sink ships. So I mean, we have to be cognizant of what's going on. But clearly, obviously, go ahead,
Todd. Just kind of looking at this and from a side perspective, Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, this was kind of hovering around 6.5 virtually all summer.
Yes.
I think you and I kind of joke back and forth that I thought Miami would open shorter by the time the game came, and we were buying Texas A&M this offseason, right? We were going over their win total.
Yep.
And so it did fall a little bit lower than that at open. I think this is probably a good number, and I just keep going back to that matchup last year where, this Miami team's certainly better than that version of Miami, and Miami went on the road to Kyle Field and really probably should have won that game. So it'll be interesting to see once the handicapping starts to break out a little bit here, if there's an opinion, because where it's at right now is a couple ticks lower than where it was this summer. The total, though, is interesting. I know this opened substantially shorter, and we've talked about A&M's pace and pushing the ball deeper down the field, and obviously Miami's offensive coordinator has a pulse now, and Van Dyke looks better, and the weapons are a little bit better, and the offensive line's better, and so it immediately leads you to an over. Probably shouldn't get too far into the weeds here, but this did top out at 52. Respected group came in and went under 52. Do you believe that, Brad, to be a real position, or kind of positioning itself to maybe come back in here and crack the over now that we're below that key some places of 51 to 50.5?
No, I don't expect it to come back over. Okay. I think, and let me say this, and I'm not trying to deflect blame. I'm not sure it was going to be in range anyways, because, I mean, I didn't give first crack on the 46.5. Somebody beat me to that.
Oh,
so
okay. Yep.
I think the word was out there. And, the podcast that I did, I mean, I didn't bring it up at all. So, I mean, I think word was already out here that over was going to be the play. But we're still, I mean, we don't have good data points, in my opinion, on either one of these teams. Yeah, they look good, but, I mean, I've seen what these two offenses have been over larger sample sizes. Until you get that resistance from the opposing defenses, I'm not there yet. I would have said, I'll say this. If it opened 51, would I have bet over, run to the window and bet over if this was the opener? No, wouldn't have been the case. I wouldn't have bet under, but I certainly wouldn't have bet over.
Such an interesting game for two teams that clearly would love to start 2-0. Who doesn't want to start 2-0? But that had a ton of questions that they had to address in the offseason in terms of their offensive capabilities. So should be a fascinating watch. 3:30 Eastern on Saturday afternoon. And when we look at college football, some of what we love is the disparity in college football hometowns. You can have a great night out in Miami. I'm not necessarily sure the nightlife in Lubbock will be the exact same way, although they do have an opportunity to create a festive atmosphere when they get a rare appearance from a Pac-12 opponent. Oregon on the road in Lubbock, a 6.5-point road favorite. Total in the game, 66.5. It is up from a low of 60.5 where it opened out here at Circa. The Pac-12, they've flexed their muscle last week. Undefeated as a conference, a perfect week for just the third time in the last 43 years. Oh, the poetic justice for a league that will no longer exist when we record this podcast in 2024. Oregon dropping 81 points on its annual FCS victim, this time Portland State. The most points scored by an FBS team since 2015, and the 9th time the Ducks have put up a 60-burger in 16 meetings with FCS opponents. Added a win off the field as well from a recruiting standpoint, so Oregon, things clearly trending the right way. When you look, though, Oregon hasn't beaten a Big 12 team in nearly a decade since routing Texas 30-7 in the 2013 Alamo Bowl. It'll actually just be the second time ever that Oregon plays a true road game against a Big 12 opponent. The only other time they visited Oklahoma back in 2004 when an unranked Ducks team lost 31-7 to OU. The quarterbacks in that game, Kellen Clemens and Jason White. It was Adrian Peterson for going for nearly 200 yards rushing on that ground. But when we look at this matchup, there is a high level of familiarity between these coaches. There is a high level of familiarity between some of these players. And Payne, we can call this the Tyler Shuck revenge game of sorts. And I have to imagine he, amongst the rest of Red Raider Nation, would love to erase a bad taste in their mouth for what happened when they traveled to the North Country and were handed an outright upset loss against Wyoming as nearly a 2-touchdown favorite last Saturday night in Laramie.
This is one of the more interesting handicaps of the week because there's so many moving parts. How much do you upgrade Oregon, right? I mean, winning 81-7 is impressive, but then Dan Lanning comes out and is like, hey, this is a paycheck game. Portland State is in our league.
His comments
wanted to give little brother $650K.
His comments were brutal in that, and I don't think he meant him to be that way, just basically taking a legitimate pot shot at Portland State. I'm thinking, man, that was rough.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically paying little brother to act as a wrestling dummy there. How much do you downgrade Texas Tech for losing to Wyoming on the surface? Probably 2.5 points. The problem is, in the very same game Texas Tech loses, we get a glimpse of a really high ceiling because Texas Tech's covering the double-digit spread 11 minutes into the damn game. So there's a version of Tech that played far better than the number you're now assigning them. And so there becomes a real art and uniqueness to adjusting both Oregon and Texas Tech's power rating this week. And then, you also have to factor in probably a little bump in Texas Tech's home field advantage for a game being played at 7 p.m., then a noon kickoff. Are you making adjustments for Road Bo Nix in his first game without Kenny Dillingham? Right? And then there's some narrative stuff, right? You mentioned the Texas Tech quarterback, Tyler Shuck, was told he wasn't good enough to play at Oregon. Texas Tech defensive coordinator.
He's not.
And then you have Tim DeRuyter, wasn't retained by Dan Lanning. So you have two gentlemen, in DeRuyter and Shuck that circled this game before the season started. I would say the largest factor for me is kind of multifaceted. It's can Texas Tech be productive enough on early downs? So to Brad's point, Tyler Shuck is good enough to not have to throw in some of these known passing situations because that's where he certainly struggles. Tyler Shuck is when he's faced with these passing situations, hasn't really been very good throughout his entire career. It's why he's now at Texas Tech. Then you have to ask yourself, is Oregon's secondary improved enough to take advantage of that weakness from Shuck? If you look at early downs last season, Texas Tech wasn't very good. They're outside the top 85 in early down EPA. It led to lots of known passing situations. That was the problem last week again for Tyler Shuck. Had a 0% success rate on passing downs the first 3 quarters against Wyoming. It led to a 7% turnover-worthy play rate. In these known passing situations, when Shuck's first read isn't there, you can see some panic start to set in. But, is the Duck secondary improved enough for Shuck to struggle in those areas? Again, you look, Christian Gonzalez, obviously, first-round pick. He was the Ducks' leading corner, was fantastic last season, and somehow Oregon was outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. Now, I think Dan Lanning, if you've read the comments all offseason, he believes Oregon secondary is better. Brought in Chris Hampton to be his co-defensive coordinator, and Hampton's specialty and pedigree is coaching defensive backs. So when you have the names and the talent back there that I think Lanning does, it would appear this is maybe more about the X's and O's and getting that sorted out, and that's where you will see improvement despite losing a key talent like Christian Gonzalez. But going back to what I said at the top about the large adjustments in opposite directions for both teams after week 1, my guess is there's going to be a battle in this game, right? Numbers guys are going to want to be on Oregon. There's going to be another faction of sophisticated bettors that's going to wait this out and bet Texas Tech in the spot when limits increase. And we've started to see some 7 pop. It'll be interesting to see like what peak pricing is on this game. But I think there's going to be a little bit of a battle here between numbers guys and then some of the larger bettors later.
When we look at Oregon too, this is a team that obviously didn't have to play their starters long, but there were a lot of key names that were suited up last Saturday, never actually got on the field. All the signs, at least what Oregon's letting out of early week practice, is that most of these guys will be available. When you look at Noah Whittington, Justin Jacobs, Evan Williams, and linebacker Mace Funa, those guys should be able to contribute in some capacity. Texas Tech dealing with a couple injuries in their own right, losing a starting middle linebacker last week in the win over Wyoming, some depth pieces as well, and some questions along the offensive line. So we'll see how Texas Tech is able to adjust in this particular spot. But Brad, when you look at the handicap, Peyton some interesting points talking about the adjustments you have to make to Texas Tech losing and what could have been seen as a look-ahead spot. I know the win expectancy suggested much better results, but they scored 17 points in the first quarter and didn't do anything until the final drive of the game that needed a field goal to force overtime. Meanwhile, Oregon, a glorified dress rehearsal of sorts. So when you have those conflicting factors, is a game like this create opportunity for you, or does it provide a few more challenges when you try and identify where there may be a team that's overvalued or undervalued in the market?
I think more challenges than opportunity because I didn't get involved really as far as the side goes. I thought that the opener, obviously, in the markets responded accordingly as far as the total was just too low. So I am a part of the original money on the over. I watched the Texas Tech Wyoming game play for play. I had money on quite a bit, side and total. I was invested, to say the least. And it was one where I thought I didn't have to worry about it when it was 17-0. And then all of a sudden, fighting, clawing, scratching for my life. And then I got it. I know a lot of the talk has been about Chuck and the lack of consistency from him. I was actually more concerned about what I saw from the Texas Tech defense. If you're familiar with Wyoming's quarterback, Andrew Peasley, not a good passing quarterback by any stretch of the imagination. Wyoming's down 3 running backs heading into the game, and yet they moved the football consistently. Peasley in some spots looked very effective throwing the ball. And if that's the case, even if you're dealing with road Badbo Knicks, I don't see if Texas Tech's going to play defense like that this week. They're not going to be successful. So I think Payne broke it down well. There's just so many moving parts for me, and the good thing about this week, not only this game, but there's 20 games similar to this, where we're finally going to get a decent data point on how good or how bad these teams
It's
are.
so interesting because I watched a lot of that game too. I know it kicked off about an hour later than expected given some of the weather in Laramie. But it was like Texas Tech built that 17-0 lead, Brad, and the defense went, all right, we're done here, because they held Wyoming 3 plays, 2 yards, 1 play, 1 yard, 3 plays, 4 yards, and then forced another turnover. Now, granted, they benefited with the points off turnovers, but clearly, to your point, allowed Wyoming to do a heck of a lot more offensively than they should have otherwise been able to do. They better make sure they're buttoned up here, because we know Oregon, you give them an inch, they will take a mile. This Ducks team does not lack explosive playmakers at the quarterback, running back, or wide receiver position. I know what all of our listeners are thinking, going, you guys have been rambling on, waxing poetically for over an hour now, and you haven't even gotten to one of the biggest games on the schedule in Texas, Alabama. Well, I have news for all of you. We're not going to get there yet, because we're diving deeper into the weeds as we'll head to Lynchburg, Virginia for our weekly installment of the Brad Non-Powers 5 matchup that sees Liberty playing host to the New Mexico State Aggies. New Mexico State sees themselves installed as a 10.5-point road underdog. Total on this game, 53. Brad, you talked about how the market likes to tip its hand, and last week we saw a massive move come in on your alma mater in Bowling Green against Liberty. It obviously depended on the number. If you took 12.5, you covered. If you took the worst of the number on game day, you lost, with Liberty winning that game 34-24. Liberty, though, had a massive edge in turnovers, still wasn't able to run away and hide, and Caden Slater, their quarterback, was the leading rusher. It appears there's a little bit of an adjustment going on with Jamie Chadwell taking over the helm from Hugh Freeze for this Flames football program.
You mentioned it. Couldn't have mentioned it better as far as context clues in the marketplace. When you see a significant line move on a team that's not, a darling among the sharper people, Bowling Green this offseason. In fact, I am considerably down on Bowling Green this season. But when you see them take considerable money, obviously the result was dependent on the number. Who would imagine a number being important? It seemed like the only time it mattered on last weekend. But the fact that the number was even in question, considering the fact that Liberty was +4 in turnovers. When you're +4 in turnovers, your cover rate is like 90+%. So the fact that had to come down and struggle against what I consider to be a bottom 10 team in college football, downgrade Liberty's power rating from that performance and from the market indicators. On the other side, I think this is another important note because there's so many FBS versus FCS games the first couple of weeks. There's like 80 of them combined. Pay attention to the moves in that marketplace, because I'm here to tell you, Barney at the bar is not betting FCS football. So anytime you see a 3, 4, 5-point move in that market, it is of the professional variety. And New Mexico State took some money in the marketplace last week. And I'll actually go back to their week 0 game, where I think I'm finding some additional value. -3 in turnovers in a Massachusetts game. Result looks poorly, and Massachusetts clearly was the right side. But still, that was a back and forth 3-point game in the fourth quarter until scoring went haywire. So I think, when you add those two factors together, Liberty turnover luck last week, New Mexico State turnover bad in week 0. On top of it, regularly down on Liberty this year. New coach, new schemes, bottom 20 in returning production. Lost some key depth guys in fall camp for the season due to injury. They had an unfortunate situation where a player unfortunately died. Big distraction. And finally, I didn't put this in the notes, but I think for a double-digit underdog, I'm not sure you're going to find a more confident bunch than New Mexico State this week. Why? Because in late November last year, they made this trip to Lynchburg, and they won by 35 points. So I got to think Jerry Kill's playing the disrespect card. You won by 35 just a couple games ago against his team in this spot, in this place, and you're still catching double digits. New Mexico State +10.5.
People always talk, Brad, about revenge angles. How much revenge would you theoretically factor in for Liberty, knowing how they were embarrassed in that particular game, knowing that Hugh Freeze already had one step out the door, and they basically didn't get off that bus in that spot?
It's enough where if Hugh Freeze is still the coach and they had a majority of their team back, I wouldn't be giving out New Mexico State +10.5. But because it's an entirely different coaching staff, most of the players are already gone, I don't think it's that big of a factor.
It's always
for
good
me.
to know. It's all those little nuggets that go a long, long way in terms of finding an edge. A point here, a point there can go a long way. Payne, I know you're a huge fan of the little guy in college football. Do you have anything you'd like to add on this game?
I can tell you that I was sent a list, and they were all going to be soon-to-be buy positions, and I was asked nicely, hey, if you're going to give out any of these on the show, please let me know. And 365 New Mexico State plus 10.5 was on that list. So fully expect this one to move, not just because of this podcast, but because of other bettors who have kind of waited to for the market to mature a little bit here that want to get down on it.
That is always good to know. When this show goes live, bettors will have to run over men, women, and children to make sure they're able to get their piece of the action on a game that I know will be front and center on the biggest TVs and all of the sports books here in Las Vegas and sports bars across this fine country. But the game I know that a lot of people will have their eyes trained on Saturday night down at Bryant-Denny Stadium, where it's the Alabama Crimson Tide, a full touchdown favorite as they'll welcome in the Texas Longhorns. Total on the game 54.5. Texas fans were hoping to use the school's allotment. Hopefully we'll enjoy scenic views of downtown Tuscaloosa sitting in the upper deck right next to the Texas Band. First meeting between these programs in Tuscaloosa since 1902. We're going to hear leading up to kickoff, Nick Saban 28-2 versus his former assistant, Steve Sarkisian, was asked about that already. He goes, what's the record? We can throw that out. We'll figure out what we're going to do about it. And when you try and figure out who these two teams are, Alabama, they took care of a lightweight, exceeded odds makers' expectations against Middle Tennessee State. Anyone who watched that game, I'm not sure you were blown away with what you saw offensively when it was just Alabama out-athleting a Middle Tennessee State defense that had no answers for Jalen Milroe. Meanwhile, Texas, they look like they operated in neutral for the first half against an in-state program in Rice, found some separation because of pedigree in that second half, but more about that Texas offense in a minute in terms of what Brad expects for Quinn Ewers against the Alabama defense. But Payne, let's start on the other side of the ball when we look at Alabama offensively matched up against the Texas defense. You can read all the comments coming out of Alabama. They have their team catchphrase now going by Lank, let all naysayers know, as if Alabama has been a hugely disrespected program over the last decade, and they're now bursting onto the scene. Last year's game, we saw Alabama win 20-19 in Austin. Quinn Ewers left that game in the first with an injury, but that was when we started to get a glimpse of the Alabama penalties. They committed 15 of them for 100 yards. It was something that plagued them throughout the course of the season in some of their biggest games. Now enter Jalen Milroe, very talented and gifted runner, but not a player that if they get off sequence can erase some of those mistakes the same way the number one pick in the draft, Bryce Young, was able to do with his improvisational skills and everything else that came along with it. I look at Alabama, and while this may be low-hanging fruit and not exactly endear me to some of the Alabama faithful that are out there, Payne, I wasn't blown away with anything that I saw at the skill positions for the Crimson Tide, whether it be running back or wide receiver. I mean, Isaiah Bond isn't elite, in my opinion, just yet compared to what we've seen in the past. And as far as some of the running backs, whether it's Roy Dale Williams or Jace McClellan, they're not Jahmyr Gibbs. They're not Derrick Henry. They're not what I would define as the traditional backs that we've seen from Alabama in the past. Tell me I'm wrong and that Alabama has a path against a Texas defense that was probably one of the more unheralded units last year in the Big 12 and maybe the country when we saw them step up on some of the bigger stages.
The biggest question for you, are any of them Josh Jacobs?
No.
Because that'll be vital
No,
to your
they are not
success
Josh
this year.
Jacobs, but they may all be very much playing in a contract year down there in Alabama.
So I would pump the brakes just a touch, but I get where you're going, because all of the off-season conversations that we've heard and we've even had amongst ourselves, right, was very much, hey, let's start Jalen Milroe, use his legs as much as you can, take the timely deep shot with the arm cannon, limit turnovers, play defense, lower variance, and win enough damn games where, Saban then believes the generational quarterback coming in and Julian Sayin will be the savior. The vibe from every media member out of SEC Media Days is that this was Ty Simpson in the lead, and now he's apparently running third string. So it's very interesting. So kind of like where I'm going with this is like there's been this massive perception change after one data point about Jalen Milroe. And, I get it. Like everyone's allowed to improve, especially, freak athletes like Milroe. And we did see slightly less panic in the pocket when I watched him against MTSU. We saw the deep ball has more touch and arc on it. But you talk to any Alabama beat writer that attended practice just a week ago, leading up to the Middle Tennessee State game, and the resounding intel you'd get back was, we just don't see it at quarterback. Now, maybe Milroe's a gamer. We obviously know he's from Texas. This is one that he's had circled. But I just start to look at that performance, and yes, scored a bunch of points. We saw Milroe be an effective passer, but Middle Tennessee State's a defense that we projected outside the top 95. So, what Jalen Milroe and the Tide offense are going to see here against Texas is going to be vastly different by me. Like I think we saw this happening, right? We saw this, a couple years in advance. We are very high on Pete Kwiatkowski, and he has clearly improved the Longhorns defense. Top 20 last year in schedule adjusted efficiency. I think the talent along the D line is better than last season. You have over 75% of the production returning in the Longhorns secondary, and the game plan's pretty obvious because I wouldn't say Texas is flapping their gums a little bit, but one of their starting corners came out, Barron, and he said in a presser yesterday, make Milroe pass the ball. That's what we want. And so, again, like the deep shots one-on-one, Milroe hit. But I would guess Pete Kwiatkowski is going to force Milroe to throw into windows, force Milroe to get to his second and third read. And again, like on the surface, looks very good. Completed 72% of his passes against MTSU. Only 55% of them were deemed accurate. So that's something interesting there. The other kind of concerning part, and we understand how talented Alabama's offensive line is, 5 stars everywhere, but you do have a true freshman starting at left tackle. Is there cohesion with this group yet? Because candidly, Alabama's offensive line struggled against MTSU. Alabama averages 1.7 yards before contact. 23% of Bama's runs were stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage. Only J.C. Latham had a positive run block grade among the Bama offensive linemen. Over 63% of Bama's rush yards came after contact. And so, Todd, to your point at the top, that's fine when you're playing a less athletic, smaller defense in MTSU. But this is the best defense Sark's had at Texas. It's a little bit of a different game here. And it wasn't the greatest pass blocking exhibition by Bama either. Jalen Milroe held on to the ball for about 2.8 seconds, slightly above average, but Bama allowed over 30% pressure rate. 29% of those pressures turned into sacks. We talk all the time about mobility. Jalen Milroe has that in spades, but it's all the other things that can equate to pressure and sacks. Pocket awareness. Right? Does Milroe immediately panic when that first read isn't there? Does Milroe drop his eyes after the first read is gone? Is Milroe completely confident pre-snap when he looks at a defense and he knows where it needs to go? This, for me, is the true test. I think we'll know what Alabama is, what they have at quarterback, what their weapons are after this. You're obviously happy, right, that Milroe looked good against MTSU. It's better than the alternative. But Texas is a different test here, and there were a lot of underlying metrics that weren't necessarily depicted in the 56-point explosion. And so I'm not shocked at all that this total, with a peak of 57.5, has crashed down below that key number of 55, and we're at 54.5.
So much familiarity between these two programs. Obviously, the headliner, Steve Sarkisian, has a relationship with Alabama, knowing what Sark did when he was on the staff there, but he's not the only one. You look at Jeff Banks, the assistant head coach, was a special teams coordinator and tight ends coach at Alabama from 2018 to 2020. Bo Davis, the defensive line coach at Texas, twice coached Alabama's defensive line for multiple stints. Kyle Flood, the co-offensive coordinator and offensive line coach, well, he was the Alabama offensive line coach in 2019 to 2020. A.J. Milwee, a Boaz, Alabama native, played for the Crimson Tide, was part of their staff as an analyst in 2019-20. So there is a high level of familiarity between these two programs. Brad, if Texas is going to take the next step, all three of us, I believe, are very bullish on their defense, but we have question marks on the offense, mainly because of the inconsistency we've seen from Quinn Ewers. Now, it's not the biggest sample size. He looked great before he left that Alabama game last year with an injury, but we also saw him, and whether he should shoulder the responsibility or that falls on the offensive staff, look like a deer in headlights against TCU late in the season as well when they had a chance to get a major win. He is coming into this spot off his first career game with 4 total touchdowns and no turnovers, was able to get in sync with his receivers on some of the deep balls versus Rice, something we saw a lot of last year during the freshman campaign. But if Alabama was smart, and we know Alabama can be stubborn, you feel like they should make Quinn Ewers throw into some of those tight windows instead of giving him man coverage on the outside, especially as Alabama is dealing with a couple injury concerns that we're going to monitor throughout the week. As we record on Wednesday, we're not sure if Malachi Moore, a preseason All-SEC pick, and Jalen Key, a player that we talked about probably more than anybody else out there on multiple preseason podcasts about his importance and one of the key additions in the transfer portal from UAB, may not be available to help that Alabama secondary against the talented wideouts, most notably Xavier Worthy wearing burnt orange on Saturday.
Yeah, so you mentioned the inconsistency for Ewers, and you know, as Payne and yourself broke down, I mean, everybody remembers Ewers performing really well against Alabama for a little more than a quarter in last year's game. The Oklahoma game that gets a bunch of eyeballs, he looked great, although Oklahoma offered little resistance. It's not like he had to go score for score, so there wasn't much pressure on him there. But after those two performances that everybody remembers, I mean, Ewers didn't just go from good to average. He went from good to well below average the rest of the season. Really struggled. Counting stats look good last week. You know, 3 touchdowns, passing, rushing touchdown, okay completion percentage. Start diving in a little bit more. I mean, missed opportunities. I mean, he was 0 for 6 on pass attempts at 20 yards or more. I think if you're going to beat Alabama, you got to hit some big plays. Last I checked, you're not going to, you know, you're lining up a bunch of 15-play drives against Alabama's defense. Weapons shouldn't be an issue on the outside. When I look at wide receiver and tight end, Worthy, Whittington, Mitchell, Sanders, I got to be honest with you, rewatching the Rice game, Bijan not there. I mean, obviously it's a significant loss. I'm not sure that I properly downgraded that. At least for that game, looks like that offense was missing something, and that being Bijan Robinson being that explosive back and also being able to catch the ball in the backfield and get some explosives from the running back receiving game wasn't there. And I'm wondering if it really shows up in a game of this type of magnitude. And I also mentioned offensive line didn't look there yet last week either. And keep in mind, this is still a relatively young offensive line for Texas, couple of true sophomores. Rice's defense, to put it in perspective, had a couple of sacks, 10 pressures. So not there yet at running back, and offensive line means that it is going to be more reliant on Ewers. And, man, he's not the guy that instills a bunch of confidence, at least at this point in his career. On the other side, Alabama's defense, you mentioned the penalties at the start in last year's game. It was honestly the Alabama defense that committed a bunch of those penalties, 11 of the 15 penalties. I know that they're pretty motivated to atone for that performance last year. But let's be real. If Ewers doesn't go down with injury, and keep in mind, Hudson Card also got banged up in that game. If those two things don't happen, I'm not sure that Alabama wins that game. Looking at last week's game, again, wasn't overwhelmed with the Alabama defensive performance. I mean, some of the counting stats look good. 3 sacks, 7 TFLs, a couple forced turnovers. You only give up 7 points, but I wasn't overwhelmed. The one player that did, I would, if you're looking at overall grades, I mean, the guy that really stood out was Jalen Key. Kudos to Payne. I mean, we had a whole hour discussion on how great Jalen Key was and how Florida State had to get Jalen Key from UAB, and never happened. But my goodness, Payne was on top of it. 0 yards allowed, 1 interception, 0.0 passer rating allowed, 89 coverage grade. And yet he's day-to-day, along with Malachi Moore. So you got to be dependent and look at the injury report for those two guys, because if they're out, there's going to be some opportunities for the Texas pass game to take advantage of it. I also thought it was interesting, Shaheem Otis, expect to play nose guard. He's 328 pounds. He's playing. They kicked him out the defensive end. I don't know if they're just trying to utilize him and put him at all the different position groups along the defensive line, but I thought that was interesting to see him out there playing defensive end when, you know, my expectation was he was going to get 80 to 90% of the snaps in nose guard.
Brad, Payne touched a little bit on the total and some of the back and forth we've seen there. This number, though, on the side, pretty much 7 painted across the board. Haven't seen a whole heck of a lot of movement there. Is it pretty in line with your expectations, you know, coming in and some of the adjustments you may have made off of each of these teams taking care of lesser foes in week 1?
I mean, I have a little bit higher on Alabama on this game, probably enough that, you know, I made a pizza bet on Alabama, thinking that it was going to go higher. No, the buyback was there already at 7.5. I mean, I don't see it moving. I think anytime it moves off this very key number, you're going to have people that want to take Texas plus 7.5. I think guys like myself, I would lay 6.5 with Alabama. So I unless Payne's got some, big group that's waiting for the limits to go super late in the week on this game, I don't see it moving off of 7.
Always interesting when you look at games like
Feels
this
like a
that
good
we
number.
know will get all of the eyes on them in that prime time slot Saturday night. Clearly a measuring stick for two teams that'll do battle as non-conference foes this year, but will be vying for SEC supremacy in the future. You can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPowers7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media. Most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board, you can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. I'll call it 6.5 games broken down as in-depth as we know how to do around here. I'm sure, Payne, if Bet the Board listeners were out there, they were going, you know what? We can't wait to hear these guys tackle New Mexico State against Liberty, but Brad does it as well as anybody in that particular regard. But we've covered all of that ground to figure out where we're going for our most actionable element from this fine program in a segment we love to call The Best Bet.
So the first clause right off the top, nothing as strong as last week. Don't have significant matches from differing viewpoints like Brad and myself. So if you got last week's best bet and you're thinking, hey, this is going to be the result every single week.
I wish it'd be that easy.
Dog being up 45-17, and then you're doubling down here. I would highly advise against that. We planned on giving out a potential total. The totals market's just getting obliterated earlier than ever before, so we're gonna refrain from that. There is a side that we do potentially like. We just envision it's going to creep up over the next 48 hours, 72 hours, so we don't want to give that out. There's one that we like a little bit here, and it's the number hasn't completely gotten away from us. We're still showing value here. Let's go with 349 Mississippi, the Ole Miss Rebels. Let's lay the 7 in this game. Todd, much to our chagrin, we were able to watch a lot of Tulane football last week. That was one of our.
We got suckered.
Candidly, that's the lone loss. Yeah, that's the lone loss that I've have this football season is South Alabama. And the point that you and I discussed, South Alabama might have the worst cornerback duo in the entire country, and Spencer Pratt certainly took advantage of that with a highly efficient day. I will say, our understanding is the defense wasn't overly tested. There's some issues there at linebacker, at safety, in the secondary for Tulane. Some potential communication issues as you step up in class against an Ole Miss offense like this. And then you watch the end of that game, Spencer Pratt looks like he's been through a war. I mean, he's got blood, gashes, cuts everywhere. He's on the bike. He's holding the inside of his left knee. I think he's going to play here, obviously.
Yeah, there's no chance Michael Pratt's going to be on the bench for this game. Let's get that out of the way.
Spencer Pratt, I said. My apologies, Michael Pratt.
We got the Pratt part right. That's all that matters. But you're right.
Go ahead.
I mean, you watch that game against South Alabama. They put the ball on the carpet early. It allows Tulane to play downhill. They took full advantage. We know that the Green Wave took money against them in the market there. Pratt on the bike, kind of flexing a knee. You may mention of some of the lacerations and all that. This kid is a gamer. He came back to Tulane when he had other offers to explore some other spots. Hell, he could have been Notre Dame starting quarterback if he wanted to take that role before they went in the Sam Hartman direction.
Florida.
Yeah, Florida probably love to have him right about now. 14 of 15, 294 yards through the air. You don't have to do the monkey math on that to realize that it's nearly 20 yards per attempt. Those aren't the kind of numbers you're going to put forth against SEC caliber defense. I mean, this is a Tulane team, and we both love Willie Fritz. We were high on them last year, but they don't rinse and repeat when it comes to replacing NFL caliber talent. Tajay Spears, the backup at the next level to Derrick Henry, and an injury away from being a true RB1 most likely in the NFL. Dorian Williams, the man who controlled that linebacking core that you mentioned, no longer there as well. And that was one of the reasons that South Alabama took some money, that there were some concerns about how this Tulane defense would fare. South Alabama comes out, tries to play with a quick pace and tempo early in that game, but when you put the ball on the carpet, you spot your opponent a free 7 points. It's always difficult to battle back. Jaguars get it to within 24-17. Yam Banks goes out with an injury, and it's good night, sweetheart. This is an Ole Miss team who we saw last week do what you need to do against an inferior opponent in Mercer. They scored 4 touchdowns early and were able to put the game on cruise control. All 3 quarterbacks on that roster, from Jackson Dart to Spencer Sanders to other kid's name is going to elude me, Walker Howard, third stringer, all took reps. This is one of the most talented rosters, not just in the SEC, but in the entire country. I think Ole Miss knows that they beat up on this team 2 years ago to the tune of 61-21. It won't be lost on Lane Kiffin and company that this is the same Tulane team that beat USC last year. To your point, you mentioned the number. Opened a little bit shorter. Still think there's some value and wiggle room here. It's not in our DNA to take an SEC team going on the road to a group of 5 opponent, but we saw last weekend there were teams that feasted in these very same spots, most notably Oregon State against San Jose State. Not saying Tulane is in that same caliber, but I'm right there with you. I show value at anything 7 or less in this game on the Ole Miss Rebs.
The other thing, when we talk about Ole Miss, you go back to the preview. We were, I think, the one podcast, I know Bama fans absolutely hated Pete Golding, but we were like, hey, this is actually a massive upgrade for Ole Miss defensively. So brought in a bunch of transfers on that side of the ball. We were expecting the Ole Miss defense to be a tick better than they were last season. And I think some of the things that Lane Kiffin's going to do offensively will expose that Tulane defense just a little bit more than South Alabama did a week ago.
No doubt about it. So a little bit of uncharted territory for those folks who've listened to this show, not used to us going down certain paths, but every now and again when there's opportunity that presents itself, you have to be willing to lay the points. Nice to have a high-powered offense at our disposal. And while we expect Pratt to play, I think estimating he'll be at 65-70% and maybe not quite as willing a runner as Tulane will need, plays a big role, knowing that last week we didn't see a single running back on their roster carry the ball more than 8 times, and Mekhi Hughes filled in, average a shade more than 5 yards per carry, but Ole Miss's defensive front, a little bit of a different animal. So that is...
Do you want to know something embarrassing, by the way?
Fire away.
And this is how, I just don't give a shit. Do you know what I just divulged to our entire listenership?
Spencer Pratt.
Any
Spencer
idea?
Pratt has to be a TV show character, and that's the reason you made the connection.
Big Laguna Beach guy as a high school college kid. One of my favorite shows. Big on LC, big on Audrina. But then they had the reboot with The Hills. And I got myself back into that just to see what my guy Justin Bobby was up to these days. And Spencer Pratt was on the mind. I just divulged to the world I'm a Hills Laguna Beach
You know what?
guy.
Honestly, I have not watched either of those shows, but I was a big OC fan back in the day. So, I mean, we all have guilty pleasures coming up through the ranks. Yes. Whether it's Dawson's Creek, Beverly Hills 90210, I'm not ashamed to admit any of that to our loyal listenership. And a long-winded way of saying we hope Michael Pratt has a great season, but we hope he performs like Spencer Pratt on Saturday down there in New Orleans against Ole Miss. So, all right, my friend, we get to come right back at it. First NFL regular season podcast of the season tomorrow. Plenty of work to get done there, so unless you have anything to get off your chest, you can save it, harness it, and share it with the world when we break down how Travis Kelce is worth 7 points to the point spread for Week 1 against the Detroit Lions.
Back tomorrow.
You got it. For all of us here at Bet the Board, again, follow Brad on Twitter at BradPowers7. You can follow Payne at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And come Saturday afternoon with an Ole Miss Rebels ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.